The crimson sun dipped behind the mountains of Korea on September 14th, 1950, casting long shadows across the Pusan perimeter, where exhausted American and South Korean forces clung to their final stronghold. General Douglas MacArthur stood on the deck of the USS Mount McKinley, his weathered hands gripping the rail as he gazed toward the distant Korean coastline. Behind him, the largest amphibious force assembled since D-Day prepared for what many considered an impossible gamble. The situation had grown desperate beyond measure. North Korean forces, backed by Soviet equipment and Chinese advisors, had swept south like a merciless tide, capturing Seoul within days of crossing the 38th parallel on June 25th. American troops hastily deployed from comfortable garrison duties in Japan found themselves woefully unprepared for the brutal reality of Korean combat. The 8th Army, under Lieutenant General Walton Walker, had conducted a fighting retreat that historians would later compare to the British evacuation at Dunkirk. MacArthur's plan defied conventional military wisdom. While enemy forces pressed against the Pusan perimeter, he proposed to strike deep behind their lines at Inchon, Seoul's port city. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had initially dismissed the scheme as madness. The tides at Inchon were among the most treacherous in the world, with variations of 32 feet between high and low water. The harbor was protected by fortified islands, and the narrow channels offered perfect killing fields for defenders. General, the Navy brass thinks this is suicide, Admiral James Doyle had warned during planning sessions in Tokyo. The gruff naval officer had commanded amphibious operations throughout the Pacific War, and his concerns carried weight. "We'll have maybe 2 hours at high tide to get our forces ashore before we're sitting ducks." But MacArthur possessed something his critics lacked: an intimate understanding of the Oriental mind, honed through decades of service in the Philippines and Japan. He knew that the very impossibility of the Inchon landing would catch the North Koreans completely off guard. Their forces were stretched thin, committed to the final push against Pusan. A successful landing at Inchon would sever their supply lines and trap them in a deadly pincer movement. The 10th Corps, hastily assembled under Major General Edward Almond, represented America's military might at its most diverse. The 1st Marine Division, veterans of Guadalcanal and Okinawa, formed the assault spearhead. These leather-necked warriors had earned their reputation in the blood-soaked atolls of the Pacific, where they had perfected the art of amphibious warfare against fanatical Japanese defenders. Supporting them were elements of the 7th Infantry Division, including many soldiers who had never heard a shot fired in anger. The contrast was stark. Grizzled Marine sergeants who had stormed beaches from Tarawada to Iwo Jima working alongside Green Army recruits fresh from training camps in Georgia and California. As evening deepened, MacArthur retired to his cabin aboard the command ship, where he studied intelligence reports by lamplight. North Korean strength at Inchon was estimated at fewer than 2,000 troops, mostly second-line units and hastily impressed civilians. However, the approaches to the city bristled with coastal artillery, and the harbor entrance was defended by Wolmi Island, a fortress that dominated the narrow channels like a cork in a bottle. The plan called for a preliminary assault on Wolmi Island at dawn, followed by the main landing against Inchon's seawalls at evening high tide. It was audacious beyond measure, requiring split-second timing and flawless execution. One miscalculation, one delayed assault wave, and the entire force could be trapped against the mudflats like sitting ducks, according to declassified documents. From the National Archives, MacArthur had told President Truman during their Wake Island conference that Inchon would be like cutting the enemy's throat with a rusty razor blade. The metaphor was apt, for the landing would require both surgical precision and brutal determination. As the general prepared for sleep, the fate of the Korean War hung in the balance, awaiting the dawn that would either vindicate his genius or expose his fatal hubris. The pre-dawn darkness of September 15th was shattered by the thunderous roar of naval gunfire as the cruisers Toledo, Rochester, and Jamaica opened their bombardment of Wolmi Island. The rocky outcrop, connected to Inchon by a narrow causeway, erupted in fountains of flame and debris as 8 tinch shells found their marks. From his position aboard the Mount McKinley, MacArthur watched through binoculars as the preliminary bombardment transformed the strategic island into a hellscape of smoke and fire. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Taplett's 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, had drawn the honor of spearheading the assault on Wolme Island. These battle-hardened veterans understood that failure here would doom the entire operation. As their landing craft churned through the choppy waters of Flying Fish Channel, they could see North Korean artillery positions erupting under the relentless naval barrage. The Marines hit Green Beach at exactly 6:33 in the morning, their boots splashing through the surf as they charged up the seawalls under covering fire from rocket-equipped landing craft. The North Korean defenders, stunned by the ferocity of the bombardment, offered sporadic resistance. Within minutes, the Stars and Stripes flew over the island's highest point, and the vital harbor entrance was secure. But the real test lay ahead. Taplett's Marines now faced a 12-hour wait until the evening tide would bring the main assault force. During this critical period, they consolidated their positions under constant sniper fire, transforming captured North Korean bunkers into defensive strongpoints. The enemy, recovering from their initial shock, began probing attacks that grew in intensity as the day progressed. Meanwhile, aboard the command ships offshore, the main assault force prepared for the evening landing. The 1st Marine Regiment under Colonel Lewis Puller would strike Red Beach directly against Inchon's seawalls. These vertical obstacles, ranging from 12 to 15 feet in height, presented unique challenges that required specially constructed ladders and scaling equipment. Colonel Raymond Murray's 5th Marine Regiment would simultaneously assault Blue Beach to the south, advancing through tidal mudflats that could trap unwary attackers in quicksand like muck. The complexity of coordinating these multiple simultaneous assaults tested every lesson learned from years of Pacific amphibious operations. As afternoon shadows lengthened, intelligence reports painted an ominous picture. North Korean reinforcements were moving toward Inchon from Seoul, including elements of the 18th and 19th Infantry Divisions. Artillery observers on Wolme Island reported enemy trucks and tanks streaming south along the Seoul-Inchon Highway, racing to reinforce the port city's defenses. The timing became even more critical. The assault waves would have perhaps 90 minutes of adequate water depth to reach the beaches. If they missed this narrow window, the landing craft would be stranded on mudflats, perfect targets for enemy artillery. MacArthur's gamble was entering its most dangerous phase. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the naval bombardment resumed with unprecedented intensity. The battleship Missouri, veteran of Tokyo Bay's surrender ceremony, added her 16-inch guns to the chorus of destruction. Carrier-based aircraft from the Valley Forge and Philippine Sea swept over Inchon in wave after wave, dropping napalm and high explosives on suspected enemy positions. Colonel Puller, known throughout the Marine Corps as Chesty for his barrel chest and aggressive leadership style, addressed his regiment from the deck of the transport ship. "We're going to show these North Korean sons of bitches what Marine firepower looks like," he declared in his characteristic gravelly voice. His words carried special weight, for Puller had earned 5 Navy crosses in previous conflicts. From Haiti to Guadalcanal, as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, landing craft loaded with Marines began their run toward Red Beach. The seawalls of Inchon loomed ahead like fortress ramparts, their concrete faces scarred by hours of bombardment, but still formidable obstacles. Behind these barriers lay an unknown number of enemy soldiers, their rifles trained on the approaches. The race against time and tide had begun, and the outcome would determine whether MacArthur's bold strategy would be remembered as brilliant generalship or catastrophic overreach. The Marines pressed forward through increasingly heavy enemy fire, their landing craft weaving between underwater obstacles as the critical moment of truth approached. The evening tide of September 15th reached its peak at exactly 7:31, and the first assault waves of Marines hit Red Beach with devastating precision. The concrete seawalls of Inchon, towering 15 feet above the harbor, became scenes of desperate hand-to-hand combat as Marines scrambled up scaling ladders while North Korean defenders poured automatic weapons fire down upon them. Colonel Puller established his command post just behind the seawall within an hour of the initial landing. From this position, he coordinated the advance inland while maintaining radio contact with supporting naval gunfire. The cruiser Rochester responded to his fire missions with clockwork precision, 8-inch shells systematically destroying North Korean strongpoints as the Marines advanced block by block through Inchon's industrial district. Simultaneously, Colonel Murray's 5th Regiment faced different but equally challenging obstacles at Blue Beach. The mudflats south of the main harbor had been transformed into a maze of rice paddies and tidal channels by the receding waters. Marines advancing inland found themselves wading through knee-deep mud while enemy snipers fired from concealed positions among the dikes and embankments. Captain John Stevens led Company George of the 5th Regiment in a flanking maneuver that would become a textbook example of small unit tactics. Realizing that frontal assault across the mudflats would result in prohibitive casualties, Stevens led his company through a drainage canal that provided cover from enemy observation. The Marines emerged behind North Korean positions, capturing an entire company of defenders who had been focused on the apparent main assault across the flats by nightfall. Both Marine regiments had established secure beachheads and were pushing inland against increasingly desperate enemy resistance. North Korean commanders, finally grasping the magnitude of the threat, began rushing reinforcements toward Inchon from their positions around Seoul. Intelligence intercepts revealed frantic radio traffic as enemy units received orders to abandon their current positions and race toward the threatened port. The success of the landing exceeded even MacArthur's optimistic projections. Casualties had been remarkably light, with fewer than 200 Marines killed or wounded in the initial assault. The careful planning, intensive bombardment, innovative tactics had combined to achieve tactical surprise on a scale that military historians would later compare to the Normandy landings. However, the real test still lay ahead. Securing the beachhead was only the first phase of Operation Chromite, the code name for the Inchon landing. The ultimate objective was Seoul itself, Korea's ancient capital and the political heart of the peninsula. Between the Marines and Seoul lay 25 miles of difficult terrain, defended by increasingly desperate North Korean forces who understood that failure to hold the capital would mean the collapse of their entire southern offensive. As Marine supply ships began unloading equipment and ammunition across the captured seawalls, MacArthur prepared for the next phase of his master plan. Elements of the 7th Infantry Division were scheduled to land the following morning, bringing the total assault force to over 70,000 troops. These soldiers would advance inland while the Marines pushed directly toward Seoul, creating an unstoppable momentum that would shatter North Korean resistance. Radio intercepts from the National Security Agency archives revealed that Kim Il-sung, the North Korean dictator, had ordered his forces to fight to the last man rather than abandon Seoul. This fanatical resistance would transform the advance on the capital into a series of bloody urban battles that would test
your American resolve and tactical doctrine, too.
Their limits. The success at Inchon had restored hope to the beleaguered forces at Pusan and vindicated MacArthur's strategic vision. But the hardest fighting still lay ahead as UN forces prepared to advance on Seoul, knowing that the enemy would defend every street and building with the desperation of cornered animals. Dawn on September 16th revealed the full magnitude of the Inchon triumph, as hundreds of landing craft ferried supplies and reinforcements across waters that had been transformed from a contested battleground into a secure harbor. The sight of American tanks rolling off LSTs onto the conquered seawalls filled Marines with confidence as they prepared for the advance on Seoul. 25 miles to the northeast, General Allman established his 10th Corps headquarters in a captured North Korean command bunker overlooking Inchon Harbor. From this position, he could coordinate the complex logistics of moving to full divisions inland, while maintaining the momentum that had made the landing so successful. Intelligence reports indicated that North Korean resistance was stiffening. As enemy commanders rushed troops from the Pusan front to defend their capital, the advance began at first light. With Colonel Murray's 5th Marine Regiment leading the way along the Seoul Highway, the terrain presented new challenges. Rice paddies intersected by irrigation. Ditches provided excellent defensive positions for enemy forces, while the single main road created a dangerous bottleneck that could be easily interdicted by artillery or airstrikes. Marine Corsair fighter bombers from the carriers offshore provided constant close air support, their distinctive bent-wing silhouettes becoming familiar sights to the advancing ground forces. These aircraft, veterans of Pacific War campaigns, proved devastatingly effective against North Korean armor attempting to reinforce Seoul's defenses. Napalm strikes turned enemy tank columns into twisted monuments of burned metal along the highway. First major engagement came at Sosa, a small town halfway between Inchon and Seoul. Here, elements of the North Korean 107th Tank Regiment had established defensive positions among the town's buildings. Their T-34 tanks, positioned to sweep the main approach road with devastating fire. The ensuing battle would demonstrate the superiority of American combined arms tactics over North Korean defensive doctrine. Captain Robert Barrow, commanding Company Able of the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, coordinated a complex assault that combined infantry, armor, and artillery in a textbook demonstration of modern warfare. Marine Pershing tanks engaged the North Korean T-34s in direct fire duels, while infantry squads infiltrated through the town's outskirts to attack enemy positions from multiple directions. The battle for Sosa raged for 6 hours. Individual buildings changing hands multiple times as Marines and North Korean soldiers fought room-to-room combat reminiscent of Stalingrad. Marine combat engineers proved invaluable, using demolition charges to blast through walls and create new avenues of advance when conventional approaches became too costly. By afternoon, Sosa was secure, but at a price. 23 Marines had been killed and over 60 wounded in the fierce fighting. The North Korean defenders fought with fanatic determination, often continuing resistance until physically overwhelmed. Intelligence officers noted that many enemy soldiers carried political indoctrination materials, emphasizing the importance of dying for the revolutionary cause rather than surrendering to capitalist aggressors. Meanwhile, parallel advances by Army units of the 7th Infantry Division encountered similar resistance along secondary roads approaching Seoul from the south. These soldiers, many experiencing combat for the first time, quickly learned the harsh realities of Korean warfare. The enemy's willingness to accept massive casualties and hopeless defensive actions challenged American assumptions about rational military behavior. As the evening approached, Marine reconnaissance patrols reported the first glimpses of Seoul's skyline. In the distance, the ancient capital, with its mixture of traditional Korean architecture and modern Japanese Zero buildings, spread across the Han River Valley like a sprawling testament to Korea's complex history. Smoke columns rose from various points throughout the city, evidence of the desperate preparations being made for its defense. Colonel Pooler established his regimental command post in a captured schoolhouse on the outskirts of Seoul's suburbs. From here, he could observe enemy defensive preparations through powerful binoculars. While coordinating with supporting artillery units positioned near Inchon, the North Koreans were clearly preparing for a building-B-building defense of their capital. With barricades and fighting positions visible throughout the city's approaches, intelligence estimates suggested that at least 15,000 North Korean troops had been concentrated in Seoul's defense, including elite units of the Korean People's Army that had been withdrawn from the Pusan front. These forces, commanded by experienced officers who had fought against Japanese occupation forces, possessed intimate knowledge of the city's layout and had spent weeks preparing defensive positions. The stage was set for what would become one of the most brutal urban battles of the Korean War. Seoul's liberation would require not just military skill, but also the kind of sustained courage that transforms ordinary soldiers into legends. As Marine units prepared for their assault on the ancient capital, they understood that the coming battle would determine the ultimate success or failure of MacArthur's audacious gamble at Inchon. The morning of September 25th brought a gray, overcast sky that seemed to mirror the grim determination etched on Marine faces as they prepared for the assault on Seoul. The Han River, which had served as Korea's political and cultural heart for over 600 years, now became the final barrier between UN forces and their objective. North Korean engineers had destroyed all the bridges spanning the river, leaving only twisted steel and concrete stumps as monuments to their scorched earth. Tactics. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Davis, commanding the 1st Battalion, 7th Marine Regiment, received orders that would test every lesson learned in amphibious warfare since Guadalcanal. His Marines would conduct an opposed river crossing against heavily fortified positions, using improvised rafts and assault boats to reach the northern bank, where North Korean machine gun nests commanded every approach. The crossing began at dawn. Under cover of the heaviest artillery barrage yet seen in the Korean War, Marine artillery batteries, positioned on the southern hills overlooking the river, fired continuously for 30 minutes, while Navy cruisers offshore added their 8-inch shells to the thunderous symphony of destruction. The ancient city's skyline disappeared behind walls of smoke and flame as high explosive shells systematically demolished North Korean strongpoints. Sergeant First Class William Jansen, veteran of Iwo Jima, led the first assault boat across the Han River's turbulent waters. Enemy machine gun fire traced deadly patterns across the water's surface as North Korean defenders recovered from the preliminary bombardment. "Keep those heads down and paddle like hell," Johnson shouted to his squad as tracer bullets whined overhead and mortar shells exploded in towering waterspouts around their fragile craft. The river crossing succeeded through sheer audacity and superior firepower coordination. Marine forward observers, positioned with the assault troops, called down precision artillery strikes on enemy positions as they were revealed by muzzle flashes. This real-time fire coordination proved devastatingly effective against defenders, who had expected to massacre the crossing force from concealed positions by noon. 2 complete Marine battalions had established secure footholds on Seoul's northern bank and were advancing into the city's outskirts against fanatical resistance. The urban fighting that followed would test every aspect of American small unit training as Marines found themselves engaged in 3-dimensional warfare among Seoul's maze of narrow streets, traditional Korean compounds, and multi-story buildings. Captain Francis Fenton, commanding Company Fox of the 7th Regiment, led his Marines in a methodical advance through Seoul's government district. Each building required individual assault, with Marines using grenades, demolition charges, and flamethrowers. 2 clear rooms occupied by North Korean snipers and machine gun crews. The fighting was intimate and brutal. It's often decided by split-second reactions and individual courage. The North Korean defense of Seoul demonstrated sophisticated urban warfare tactics that would influence military doctrine for decades. Soldiers had prepared interconnected defensive positions with multiple escape routes, allowing them to conduct fighting withdrawals while inflicting maximum casualties on advancing Marines. Buildings were booby-trapped with improvised explosives, and key intersections were covered by interlocking fields of fire from multiple positions. Colonel Homer Litzenberg, commanding the 7th Marine Regiment, established his command post in Seoul's former police headquarters, a symbolic gesture that emphasized the restoration of legitimate authority. From this position, coordinated the complex urban battle while maintaining communication with supporting units still crossing the Han River. Under intermittent enemy artillery fire, the fighting reached its climax around Seoul's ancient Deoksujung Palace, where North Korean commanders had established their final defensive positions. Among buildings that had witnessed centuries of Korean history, Marine assault teams advanced through palace courtyards that had once hosted royal ceremonies, now transformed into killing fields where modern weapons shattered ancient stonework. Staff Sergeant Robert Simonek earned the Medal of Honor during the palace fighting, throwing himself on an enemy grenade to save his squad members from certain death. His sacrifice epitomized the individual heroism that characterized the Seoul battle, where ordinary Marines performed extraordinary acts of courage in the face of determined enemy resistance. By evening, advance elements of the 7th Regiment had reached Seoul's city center, where they raised the American flag over the capital. Building in a ceremony that symbolized the restoration of South Korean sovereignty. However, sporadic fighting continued throughout the night as North Korean soldiers conducted desperate counterattacks against Marine positions. Intelligence reports confirmed that organized North Korean resistance in Seoul was collapsing, with enemy units attempting to withdraw northward across the 38th parallel. The successful capture of the ancient capital represented more than a tactical victory. It restored South Korean government authority and demonstrated American commitment to defending democratic allies against communist aggression. According to archived reports from Stars and Stripes newspaper, the liberation of Seoul cost the Marines over 300 casualties, but North Korean losses exceeded 5,000 killed or captured. The ancient capital had been freed through courage, sacrifice, and the kind of tactical excellence that would make the Battle of Seoul a studied example in military academies. Worldwide, the liberation of Seoul on September 28th created shockwaves that reverberated far beyond the Korean peninsula. In Washington, President Truman received word of the victory during a cabinet meeting, prompting spontaneous applause from officials who had privately questioned MacArthur's risky strategy. Meanwhile, in Pyongyang, Kim Il-sung faced the collapse of his entire southern offensive as his armies found themselves trapped between the advancing 10th Corps and the reinvigorated 8th Army breaking out of the Pusan perimeter. General Walker's 8th Army, which had spent months defending the desperate perimeter around Pusan, launched their breakout offensive on September 26th. The 24th Infantry Division, under Major General John Church, led the assault northward along the same roads where they had conducted their fighting retreat just weeks earlier. The psychological impact on both American and North Korean forces was profound. Soldiers who had recently fought as desperate defenders now advanced as confident liberators. The coordination between MacArthur's two-pronged offensive demonstrated strategic planning at its most effective. While 10th Corps drove north from Seoul, cutting North Korean supply lines and capturing critical transportation hubs, 8th Army pressed northward from Pusan, forcing enemy units into an ever-tightening pocket. North Korean commanders found themselves caught between hammer and anvil, their forces fragmenting as unit cohesion collapsed under the relentless pressure. Colonel John McCallis, commanding the 27th Infantry Regiment, led his Wolfhounds in a rapid advance that exemplified the transformation of American forces since the dark days of July. These soldiers, many of whom had been inexperienced recruits during the initial North Korean assault, now demonstrated the tactical proficiency that comes from surviving intense combat. Their advance northward resembled a pursuit rather than a conventional military operation. The human cost of North Korea's gamble became apparent as UN forces liberated towns and villages throughout Central Korea. American soldiers discovered evidence of systematic atrocities committed against South Korean civilians, including mass graves and destroyed villages that revealed the true nature of the communist occupation. These discoveries hardened American resolve and provided moral justification for the costly campaign. Near Osan, scene of the first major engagement between American and North Korean forces,
Elements of the 1st Cavalry Division
encountered retreating enemy columns attempting to escape northward. The ensuing battle demonstrated how completely the tactical situation had reversed since July. North Korean T-34 tanks, which had once seemed invincible to American forces, were now systematically destroyed by improved American tactics and newer equipment. The collapse of North Korean resistance was so rapid that logistical challenges became more pressing than enemy action. American supply lines, stretched over hundreds of miles of Korean terrain, struggled to maintain the advancing forces with adequate ammunition, fuel, and rations. Transport aircraft flew continuous missions from Japan, dropping supplies to forward units that had outpaced their supporting echelons. MacArthur, visiting the recaptured city of Seoul, surveyed the devastation with mixed emotions. The successful execution of his Inchon gamble had vindicated his strategic vision and restored his reputation as America's premier military commander. However, the ancient capital bore terrible scars from the urban fighting, with entire districts reduced to rubble by artillery bombardments and street-by-street combat. The restoration of Syngman's government to Seoul carried profound political implications that extended far beyond military considerations. The South Korean president, who had fled south during the initial North Korean assault, returned to his capital, accompanied by American officials who emphasized the importance of democratic governance. The ceremony took place in the damaged Capitol building, where bullet holes and artillery scars provided stark reminders of freedom's price. Intelligence estimates suggested that over 100,000 North Korean soldiers had been killed, wounded, or captured during the campaign, effectively destroying their army as an organized fighting force. The remnants of Kim Il-sung's military were retreating in disorder across the 38th parallel, abandoning equipment and deserting in massive numbers as unit discipline collapsed. By early October, advance elements of the 8th Army reached the 38th parallel, the artificial boundary that had divided Korea since 1945. The question now facing American policymakers was whether to halt at this line or pursue the retreating North Korean forces into their homeland. MacArthur strongly advocated continuing the offensive to unify Korea under democratic rule, arguing that failure to complete the victory would invite future communist aggression. The success of Operation Chromite had transformed a desperate defensive war into a victorious offensive campaign, but it also created new strategic dilemmas. The entry of Chinese forces remained a constant concern, as intelligence reports suggested. Massive troop buildups north of the Yalu River. The stage was set for decisions that would determine not just Korea's future, but the broader trajectory of the Cold War in Asia. The morning of October 1st, 1950, found General MacArthur standing at the 38th parallel, gazing northward toward the mountains of North Korea. Behind him stretched a liberated South Korea, its people, emerging from the nightmare of communist occupation to rebuild their shattered nation. The impossible gamble at Inchon had not merely succeeded, it had achieved one of the most complete military reversals in modern history, transforming certain defeat into overwhelming victory. The strategic implications of the Inchon landing extended far beyond the Korean peninsula. In Moscow, Stalin's confidence in his North Korean protégés had been shattered. Forcing a fundamental reassessment of communist strategy in Asia, Chinese leadership under Mao Zedong faced an agonizing decision: allow the complete destruction of their North Korean buffer state or risk direct military confrontation with American forces approaching their border. President Truman, executing the nation from the Oval Office, praised the Korean victory as vindication of American resolve. In the face of communist aggression, the successful landing at Inchon, he declared, demonstrates that free nations, working together, can defeat any totalitarian threat. The president's words carried special weight, as polls showed American public support for the Korean intervention had risen dramatically following Seoul's liberation. The human cost of MacArthur's gamble had been remarkably modest compared to initial estimates. Total American casualties during the Inchon operation numbered fewer than 500 killed and wounded, while North Korean losses exceeded 50,000. This extraordinary ratio reflected not just superior American firepower and tactics, but also the psychological impact of being caught completely off guard by an operation their commanders had deemed impossible. Major General Oliver Smith, commanding the 1st Marine Division, addressed his assembled regiment officers in a ceremony outside the recaptured South Korean capital. "You have participated in one of the great amphibious operations in military history," he declared, his voice carrying across the formation of Marines who had scaled Inchan's seawalls under fire. "Your actions have restored hope to an entire nation and demonstrated American courage to the world." The technological lessons learned at Inchon would influence American military doctrine for decades. The successful coordination of naval gunfire, close air support, and ground assault demonstrated the effectiveness of joint operations when properly planned and executed. Marine innovations in scaling equipment and urban warfare tactics became standard training throughout American military schools. Captain Francis Fenton, who had led Company Fox through Seoul's government district, received the Navy Cross for his leadership during the urban fighting. In his medal ceremony, he reflected on the transformation of his Marines from the desperate defenders of the Pusan perimeter to confident liberators advancing through North Korea. "We learned that American soldiers, properly led and equipped, can overcome any obstacle," he observed. The international community took notice of America's Korean success, with NATO allies expressing renewed confidence in American military capabilities during the early Cold War period. The demonstration that communist expansion could be stopped and reversed encouraged resistance. movements throughout Eastern Europe and strengthened Western resolve during the Berlin crisis. However, the very success of Inchon created new challenges that would shape the remainder of the Korean conflict. MacArthur's confidence in American military superiority led to strategic decisions that would ultimately bring Chinese intervention and extend the war for 3 more years. The general's belief that no Asian power could successfully oppose American forces would prove tragically mistaken. The veterans of Inchon carried their combat experience into subsequent Korean battles, providing leadership and tactical expertise that proved invaluable during the brutal fighting that followed Chinese intervention. Many of these Marines would later serve in Vietnam, where the urban warfare lessons learned in Seoul streets would again prove relevant. According to recently declassified documents from the Truman Presidential Library, the Inchon operation influenced American strategic thinking throughout the Cold War, establishing amphibious capability as a cornerstone of power projection doctrine. The landing demonstrated that American forces could strike anywhere in the world with decisive effect, a capability that proved crucial during subsequent international crises. The Battle of Inchon remains studied in military academies worldwide as an example of how strategic audacity, combined with tactical excellence and technological superiority, can achieve victory against overwhelming odds. MacArthur's gamble had succeeded beyond his most optimistic projections, exploring South Korean independence and establishing the foundation for that nation's remarkable transformation into a prosperous democracy. The legacy of September 10th, 1950 extends beyond military history to encompass broader themes of courage, sacrifice, and the defense of freedom against totalitarian aggression. The Marines who scaled Inchon sea walls and the soldiers who liberated Seoul demonstrated that free men fighting for just causes possess advantages that no dictatorship can match. Their victory at Inchon became a beacon of hope during the darkest years of the Cold War, proving that democracy's defenders could triumph against any odds. When their cause was righteous and their resolve absolute,